Now, um, the second piece of this is this again is still the pre-war on drugs, and that is the Harrison Act of 1914. All right. Francis Burton Harrison was an American-born Filipino statesman. That is, he was born in the United States and he was a Filipino ancestry. One of his parents was from the Philippines, and this is a reminder, actually, that the Philippines was occupied until the United States until after World War II. And so Congressman Harrison, for the few years he was in Congress, he represented the state of New York for about 5 years, from about 1909 to 1915. And while he was there, he proposed this act, which became known as the Harrison Act of 1914. And this is the first time that the U.S. government seeks to tax and regulate the importation and distribution of opium and coca products. And some of the proponents saw this as a way of showing China that the U.S. government was willing and able to begin to control the flow of opium into the United States. And it was also a way to obviously to begin to realize some income from the use of opium and cocaine. All right. The challenge, though, is that the enforcement of a law like this was inevitably subjective and became very punitive. And so even though it was relatively easy to get opium and cocaine basically illegally, that is not paying taxes, and was obviously much less expensive, it was relatively easy, at least in the early years, to avoid paying taxes or to avoid any contact with law enforcement. But what it did do is it began to lay the foundation for drug use and drug purchasing and distribution, basically to be in the black market. It is important to note that marijuana was left out of the final bill, even though there were some suggestions that marijuana be included in the Harrison Act of 1914. Marijuana was not basically made illegal or generated any taxes until 1937. And so basically, marijuana was, basically legal to use and to get until 1937. But by 1914, we're beginning to see the birth of a culture of the criminalization of the purchase of cocaine products and opium products. All right. Now we're going to jump up to 1971. All right. As most of you will recall, Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968. And he was elected partly on the basis of being a law and order candidate. He was elected partly to figure out what to do about the abuse of drugs. And so you're not going to be surprised to know in 1971, Richard Nixon openly declared war on drugs, okay, in 1971. All right, now no, I can't use that. Okay, I'm going to experiment with the pens later on. Okay, now why 1971? Okay. In the late 1960s, the Nixon presidency had already experimented with something we'll see in a few minutes called Operation Intercept. And Operation Intercept attempted to control drug trafficking in Mexico. And in the 1960s and early 1970s, most of the drugs that originated in Mexico were marijuana. Cocaine was beginning to be shipped through Mexico from Colombia, but in the late 60s and early 70s, it was mostly marijuana. Heroin, however, now we've mentioned this in the past, and this becomes a little more important for the purposes of understanding drug trafficking in Latin America. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the bulk of heroin available in the United States was actually shipped through something called the French Connection. And so the poppies were grown either in Turkey or Indochina, that is Vietnam or Laos, and shipped and processed to Turkey. And from Turkey, and then it was shipped to France through the port of Marseille. Now, we do know in the up until the late 1960s, there were heroin processing facilities in Marseille. Marseille, as you may know, is a port on the Mediterranean, a very active port, and it was a convenient place to introduce heroin into France for the purposes of then sending and smuggling it to both the United States and Canada. And so the Turkey, okay, would you excuse me just for a minute? Okay, I'm back again. Okay, Turkey in the early 1970s finally agreed to stop, to eliminate the cultivation of poppies. And basically, the French Connection was exploded. And so that affected the supply of heroin in the United States, but it did not really affect the demand. All right. All right. So the French Connection was explored in a couple of movies. The most famous one was The French Connection, starring Gene Hackman. There's a reference to it at the end of this PowerPoint. I haven't seen it in a long time. I guess it's available on Netflix. It's a great movie and it really shows basically the French Connection, the network of commercial relationships that promoted the production and distribution of heroin in Turkey through France to the big lucrative markets in Canada and the United States. All right, so in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was founded. Now, all right. Now, in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was founded. All right. And the Drug Enforcement Administration was organized by the Nixon administration in 1973. The intention was to coordinate efforts that had already been, some of them fairly successful, groups in the Treasury Department and the Justice Department and Customs. Okay, excuse me a minute, please. Now, the stated purpose of the Nixon administration was to coordinate the efforts that already existed in the federal government to create an autonomous agency administration that would actually go as far as not only coordinating efforts within the federal government, but to work with agencies outside of the federal government, to work with states, and they left the possibility open that that the DEA could work with other countries as well. All right. Now, it has come to light since that. Excuse me, Maeve, can you get down? It has come to light in recent research that the original negotiations for the Drug Enforcement Administration included some individuals who saw an opportunity to address some of the civil discord that had arisen in the 1960s through the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement. And so we had seen already in the 1930s there was an association between African Americans and the use of marijuana, particularly African American males. But this offered an opportunity to a very conservative administration to address unrest in the Black community. And so there is a book that I highly recommend. It's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And she's very adept at showing the relationship between the establishment of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the war on drugs, and the dramatic increase in incarceration of African American males. It is one of the best books I've ever read. And the reference to it is at the end of the PowerPoint. Okay. We'll visit the DEA again later in the course. All right. Now, as you know, Richard Nixon was forced to resign. Gerald Ford became president, and Gerald Ford continued some of the same policies that Richard Nixon began. There was not a great deal of critical thought about how the country could actually come to terms with the availability and the use and abuse of illicit drugs. And so Gerald Ford sort of begins to take his own road, and he appoints a task force called to develop a white paper on drug abuse. Now, the Ford administration begins to talk about the balance of law enforcement with the effective treatment of drug abuse. That is, however, there was not as many resources or money applied to treating drug abuse as there had been before. The white paper that resulted from this particular effort by the Ford Foundation actually is available online. You can look it up. That might be the focus of your paper for the course, because it's so easily available. But my own thoughts are that probably the most significant piece of the very short-lived Ford presidency for the war on drugs is the very liberal, socially liberal policies that he and his family actually espoused. We had no way of knowing in the mid-70s when Ford was president, but his wife Betty Ford was actually an alcoholic, and later would be very famous for going into rehabilitation, and eventually opening a very famous the very famous rehab clinic in California, which actually still exists and is still very widely recognized. And so his short-lived presidency didn't really challenge the war on drugs. It just sort of continued it. All right.